Racism isn't necessarily just disliking someone or not wanting to be around someone because of their race. In fact, racism is a bigger societal issue where you have structures that have been set up for years and years and years that benefit certain people. And whether you like it or not, it's something that you benefit from because of the way that our country has been founded. We can see this in the way that racial bias plays out. There are people who would never hurt a fly who find themselves falling victim to these racial biases and this racism that we all tend to have. And so more than anything, racism, what's really scary about it is that most racist people don't know that they're racist.
I can remember in middle school, like, telling people where I live. I live in the West End, probably like deep in the West End, and people would like look at me like surprised because I didn't act like I was from the West End, and I could never understand how you could act like you're from the West End. That's when I kind of realized how people saw me, or the first thought that comes to their mind when you tell them something like that.
I was an administrator in which he called himself a wigger, and I was the only black person in the room, and I felt really uncomfortable about that. And he didn't seem I laughed because I was like really comfortable, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm not joking." And I just could not believe that as like an administrator, and he's white, and I can't believe that as an administrator he thought that would be okay to say to me, or anybody for that matter, in any capacity, like no matter if he was joking or not. And I guess like I realized how I'm trying to think of the word, like racially inept people are.
I guess the common stereotype would just be like someone who's not educated, someone who doesn't go to college, someone who's involved in violent crimes, who sags their pants, who doesn't dress appropriately or something. There's different, I guess, angles of a stereotype, but I guess that would be like the main one.
When I'm at work getting carts outside or whatever, and someone's in their parked car and they look over and they see me, and I can smile, or I just look away, and I can hear the click. I can hear them lock their car doors, or I can just see, people actively avoiding me, if I'm at work or something. Sometimes it's funny, but sometimes it's like, even though we've come a long way, we still have far to go.
See it all the time. I can remember being at the park playing ball. It was kind of late, probably about 8 or 9, but it was in the summer, so it was still light outside. And they told us to go home, but of course, I was left, but a few of my friends didn't. And one of my friends got tackled, like face in the ground, just for saying that I'm not going home. So I've seen it, I've seen it happen, so that's why I just stay away.
To me, I think it means going above and beyond, because there's always this stereotype with black males, and I think going outside those stereotypes and I guess proving others wrong, that not everyone fits into that stereotype. I guess getting an education by the way I dress, the way I present myself, by the way I speak, just making a statement that there's not this stereotype that all black males fit into.
I remember like a very clear time, because when I was younger, when I was 5 and 6, I went to a private school in Massachusetts, and I went to school with maybe 500 kids, and I was one of 2 black kids in the entire school. And it wasn't something that I even really recognized or even knew. I mean, they were like all my friends. It wasn't anything that I was aware of. But at the time, I had an afro when I was younger, but I always used to braid it so that it fell down on my shoulders. And I remember there was one time I always remember my mom was like, I don't have time to braid it today. We'll just put it in like a ponytail. And I had a lot of hair. I was also just really tiny, so I was really small, and I had all of this hair. And I was like, I cannot go to school like that, Mom. And she's like, well, why not? And I was like, I just do not, none of my friends have hair like this. And I remember all day I just wore this sweater around my head. I was so embarrassed. And I remember coming home crying, and I was like, Mom, no one else's hair like me, because the other black girl at the school, we were in the same grade, but at this point, her mom was already letting her straighten her hair, but my mom was making me keep my natural hair. And I just remember that was my very first time realizing, like, okay, I'm like a little different than my friends, and it's like harder for some reason. Like, I'm the only person who looks like this, and that was like the very first time, I think, that I realized.
I remember in 5th grade, I was in an AP class, and I looked around the room, and there was like 3 other black kids in there, and I was like, oh. I told one of my friends, I was like, there's only 3 black kids in this class, and she was like, oh, I guess there is, and I guess that's when I really started to notice it is, I guess like towards 5th grade, once I was 10, I started noticing, you know, sometimes the lack of black people in my class, depending on where I lived. And so I lived down in a place that doesn't have a lot of black people there anyway, and so I guess I started to notice that.
It's really hard to say, because they said Mike Brown was guilty of some things, of, you know, like hitting him like in a car or something. I don't know if that was true or not, but I mean, if so, there's other things you can do. You can tase them, you know, you can shoot them 5 or 6 times. That was crazy to me. You didn't have to kill him, man. And they also said as he put his hands up after he had been shot, but he still continued to fire. I mean, you know, and if that's true, that's brutal. I think there's other things that you can do. You definitely didn't have to kill him.
They've definitely showed me that while the fight isn't over for racial equality, it's definitely come a long way. Even though when we look back at people who've marched and boycotted and suffered, some have even died to get racial equality, we're still not there yet. And I've just come to realize now that the fight is mine now. It's my job now to pick up the reins. It's my job to take initiative, to take action, and to move and to do the things that the people before me did, so the people who come after me won't have to take up the reins, and by then the fight will hopefully be over. But if not, they'll definitely have an example or role model to look up to besides the older ones.
I've been seeing a lot of people, they'll say, like, who are in support of, you know, Ferguson protesters and stuff like that, and they'll say, like, oh, you know, like, we're back in the 1960s or we're back in the 1950s. And I could totally see, you know, thinking like that, but that's actually a really privileged standpoint to think, like, oh, we must have gone back in time, but we haven't. Things have been like this for a really long time. Things didn't, like, magically get better for years, and now we're, like, reversing. They really haven't gotten all that much better. And so I think it's been a waking up moment for a lot of people who don't have to deal with that on a regular basis, to say, like, wow, you know, like, things aren't as good as we thought they were. But for me, like, you know, growing up, I've always been in I grew up in a predominantly white schools. I lived in the suburbs. I've always been, like, very painfully aware of being really different. And so this isn't something that really came to me as a surprise at all. And I think it really just shows, more than anything that the biggest problem with racism isn't, people have this idea that when they think of racist, they think of, like, the KKK, and they think of people who, like, go around and terrorize and do, like, hate crimes and stuff, but that's not the racism we're really dealing with anymore. We're dealing with racial bias that everyone has, and that we don't even realize that we have until we, like, do things, or until we're scared and we have a gun in our hand. And the next thing you know, you, like, shot a teenager, like, 16 times in the chest, and that's something that we're dealing with now. It's not that no one now would call themselves racist, as they might have 50 years ago, but this just shows that what we're dealing with is actually harder to get rid of because it's not an obvious thing.
I think the same things will continue to happen. I don't think as many. Maybe the numbers will go down, but as far as, I think racism will be here forever.
I have a little sister. Her name is Nias, and she is 5 years old, and one of her favorite movies to watch is Tangled. And me and her had seen it a bunch of times, like a whole bunch this year, last year. When last year we were watching it, and she stopped me and she said, "Sissy, why am I not pretty like Rapunzel?" And it was just, it really caught me off guard. I'd never heard her say anything like that. And at the time, she was barely 4. She might have been like 4.5. And I said, nice, why do you think that? Why don't you think you're as pretty as Rapunzel? And she said, oh, it's because my hair isn't blonde and it's not long and I have brown skin. And that was the very beginning, I guess, of me realizing some of the things that my sister dealt with, because I dealt with some of the same things when I was younger. And I guess I hadn't realized that stuff didn't just go away. Like, there's people who are still dealing with these issues. And so I began looking into topics of diversity, because I realized that part of the reason my sister thinks like that is because she doesn't see very many positive images of herself on TV, especially in books. She just doesn't see anyone who looks like herself. And she starts getting these ideas about it. So I began researching and doing a lot of stuff, mainly with like speaking events and stuff, to try and figure out if my sister is the only one who feels like this. And the more that I learn about it, I realize this is a huge problem that we're dealing with.
My little cousin, because my dad's mixed, so he's I have like a white side of my family. She started living with my grandparents, and so she had never been around black people before. And so the first time she met me, she said, I never met a brown girl before. And she asked me if she could paint me peach like her. And I was like, oh my gosh, we have to do something to stop people from feeling like this. And she's only 6, but just that she was like not, that she thought that she could, like, you know, that she had been so not used to being around black people that she like asked me that. I thought that was crazy, especially like with the time that we live in. I guess I kind of just expected people to be okay with that, and her to be so young and to say that to me, and like have like a huge part of her family that is black. I guess I was really surprised, and I was just like, we have to start doing something like this. She's this young. I can't imagine people who are our age, and then they also have like this lack of knowledge about black people and things like that. And I just wanted to be able to rectify that situation, because that's not a good thing to have happen.
My little brother, I think he's too young to really understand what's going on right now, but I don't worry about him too much. Hopefully by the time he's a teenager that it'll be calmed down more, but I don't worry about him too much. I don't think that he should have to. I don't think he should have to worry either. I mean, at one point I will sit down and have a talk with him, but I won't put that in his head yet, because I don't think he's experienced anything to make him think that, oh, I'm black, something's wrong with me. I won't put that in his head.
I have 2 little brothers, they're 10 and 11, and I get so nervous, like especially what happened with that little kid in Cleveland. Like after, like, you know, the whole time it was, I mean, of course it was so sad, but it was older boys. Like, my brothers aren't that old yet, they'll be fine. But then that kid that got shot in Cleveland, he was like their age. They're in 6th and 5th grade, and those cops did not give him a chance to even do anything. And I'm just so worried that something might happen to them, like whenever they go out. And I try not to say anything or like get upset around them, but I get like really nervous about something happening to them.
The first thing is we have to open a conversation about it, and we have to be willing to talk about it. Race is one of those taboo things no one really wants to talk about. We want to act like it's all over and that it's something that, like, some weird trend we went through a few years ago. But we have to talk about it, and it has to become something that we talk about in schools, I think, is the biggest part. Like, we need to take an active stance to including it in our social studies classes and in our English classes. We have to be reading things and constantly exposing ourselves to new ideas, because I think we've all shown that when you've grown up with some ideas for like all your life, the only way you're gonna ever get exposure is at your school. And I don't think our schools are doing a good enough job. Like, this is supposed to be the place where you can challenge some of the ideas you've had since birth. So I think the start would be an exposure through education.
We have to stop associating ourselves with derogatory terms and ideas and values. We can't associate black people with bad grammar and associate white people with good grammar all the time. We can't associate black people with a bad work ethic and associate white people with a good work ethic, because we're still making those, we're forming our own stereotypes. We can't hold each other down by when we see a child or another black person trying to use correct grammar or do their work or on time, come back to work after their break, for God's sakes. We can't call them, you know, crackers or Uncle Toms, or, you know, just look at them derogatorily, because then we're not helping ourselves. We're just making black people, we're just saying, you're obviously not a black person because you don't use bad grammar, you're not smart. I mean, you're smart. That means you can't be black if you're smart. You can't be black if you use good grammar. You can't be black if you don't cuss. You can't be black if you're not aggressive. You can't be black if you're not smart aleck. It's just, that can't happen anymore. And if we want to progress, we have to progress wholly. We can't just, stay with the slave mentality. And that's what hinders a lot of black people, the slave mentality. Harriet Tubman said, "I freed 1,000 slaves, and I could have freed 1,000 more if they only knew they were slaves."
Like, it's okay. Like, people who say they don't see race, like, that doesn't make any sense, because you're always gonna see people's race. But, like, making it so that it's not so alien to you, making other races not so alien to you, and knowing what's okay to say to somebody else who's a different race than you, I think is really important. And if you start teaching kids at a young age, like, you have to respect people's races, and there are some things that you can say that you can't say to people, because that's offensive. Like, for someone to be as old as this administrator was to say wigger, and he not know that's okay, that was ridiculous. And I understand what happened with my little cousin more, but still, that was a little bit, it's just all about, like, getting education and, like, getting people to understand at a young age, and already into, like, I guess integrating them with, like, people of their different races at a young age, because when you're young, you often get separated, because it depends on where you live. You don't really get to pick your friends. You don't really go out and look for people who are different from you. You just stay with what's around you, and if you're not exposed to people who are different than you, then you're not going to know how to behave around people that are different than you. So it's all about, like, early exposure to people who are different and who might look different than you or might talk different than you. That will help as you get older for you to be able to be aware of what's okay to say and not be so shocked when you meet somebody who is different.
We had a conversation with Nias, this was just like 2 days ago, because she was doing that little rhyme that kids say in elementary school where they're like Japanese, Chinese, where they like do their thing with their eyes, and she doesn't even know what like Japanese is. She just like did it, and we were like, Nice, do you even know what that means? And she was like, I don't know, like you just do your eyes, it's like this fun thing. And I just remember being like, Nice, like that's another person that's like different like you, and like you remember how you felt when like this happened. And I mean, first of all, she doesn't even know like what race is, but I mean she's painfully aware that like, oh, she knows that I'm brown and like this person isn't. And so like we've definitely had conversations about it, but I mean it's difficult because you don't know how to, like, I don't know how to talk to her without making things worse. Like I want her to be aware of things without like making her feel any more marginalized, and I'm sure she already does.
I don't like being, the first black person to do something, or I just want to be the first person to do this, or the only person to hold this record, the only person to do this, because to be a black, to only be seen in black, there's a quote, and he says, we need not emphasize Negro history, but emphasize the Negro in history, because history is one collective thing. And so I'd rather be the one guy who stands out amongst all people and not just the guy who stands out amongst black people. And so what I do appreciate, though, is the fact that black people have come as far as they've come. And I appreciate being a part of that, and that's why I try to participate in as many things as possible and just show people that it's okay to be black. Being black is not a hindrance. Being black is not inferiority, and being black is not diminish your value in any way.
Even though we say we don't, we judge people based off their color. I'm guilty of it. Like I'm a white guy. Oh, he's probably rich. Got a bunch of money. And I'm sure he might look at me like, oh, you might live in the West End, be a little poor. But until we stop judging people, until we actually know people, it won't be a change. We have to just actually try to get to know somebody before we judge them, because other than that, before we do that, it won't be a change.
I think the first thing I would say is that just because you maybe don't see yourself, like when you turn on the TV or like on the, when you open a book, doesn't mean you're not there. And I think that's something my sister, like this whole invisibility thing where you're like, well, there is no one else like me, and I'm the only like feeling like I'm the only person who has this experience. That's one of the most detrimental things, is just feeling so alone and like no one else has experienced that. So I think the first thing would be recognizing that there are like other black kids out there.
People are going to judge you for your race, but not all people are going to use that against you. Everybody who you meet is probably gonna look at you, see your race, and come up with their own things about you, but it's all about you to either prove those things right or wrong.
The hardest thing for me was being not only black, but also black and pretty privileged. Like I only grew up in the suburbs, and so there were black kids I couldn't relate to because I felt really isolated. And so that would be something that I definitely tell my sister, is that you're not by yourself. Like there are other people who relate to you. And then the other thing I would tell them is that sometimes you have to, if you really want to learn about a situation, especially something as controversial as Ferguson or race or sexism or whatever it is, you have to take, sometimes you need to unfortunately take your own initiative, and you have to learn it. And sometimes it comes with turning off the TV and just like opening a book.
You shouldn't let what other people automatically think about you affect the way that you really are. Don't let what people think of it, don't let the stereotypes of your race become you unless they are actually true for you. You don't have to fit into a box about your race, and you're not going to be any less of your race if you don't fit into that box. You're just going to be you, you're going to be a person who just so happens to be black, and you're going to act the way that you act. Your race is just a little, very tiny part of who you are, and even though our society puts a big emphasis on it, it's really shouldn't be as big of a deal as it is.
I try to act as a role model just by not being the stereotypical aggressive and violent black male. I try to, obviously stay in school, do my best, make sure people understand, especially younger black males, understand that they aren't supposed to, or they don't have to stay within certain limits when it comes to what they want to be or what they want to do, and they have all the options that other people have because, like I said, the people who came before us, they fought. So now we have access to public education and higher education. So now we can do more than just be construction workers or use or work with our backs, but now we can work with our minds, and we have access to education, what I think was the biggest thing that was given to us by those who came for us and fought for us, because now that we have that access to the education, there are so many doors open to us now. And so just making sure, drilling, teaching that into people younger than me, people my age, and some people that's even older than me, just letting them know that we have to, in order for us to go further, we have to know further.
I think social media is one of the biggest, the best advocates we have for all of these social issues. We're at a time now when things are going on in Ferguson, and I remember turning on CNN that night, seeing the riots, and they were playing like the same clip, of this burning building. But I actually followed people who live in Ferguson because I decided I would follow some of the teenagers there, and I got to see this whole other side of it that you don't get to see on Twitter. And for example, when the NAACP building was bombed a few weeks ago, I didn't even hear about that on CNN. I heard about it on Twitter, and I hear all of these things like so much quicker. And people are so, especially older people, are so quick to point fingers at Twitter like it's the one like murdering people, but it's not. Like, this is the only way sometimes you can get an accurate and quick view of things. Like, I've seen vines and stuff like going on in Ferguson and all those things, and I think it's really amazing. When you think about all of the things that have happened lately, and especially like over the past few centuries, the more you learn about it, I know especially for me, it was something that when my eyes were open to it, it became really depressing just thinking like how far we have to go. But something that has been, I guess, an inspiration for me is just remembering that we already have made so many strides and we've already progressed so much. And I know that it really just comes down to having a creative minority of people, or like-minded people who are passionate